Thanks so much for coming. This is definitely a bigger turnout. I didn't know what kind of turnout I was going to get, so I really appreciate you guys taking the time. It's nice to have the opportunity after we've been in this building for several decades to actually talk about my work to an audience internally and to people here from outside the department or even outside the academic environment completely. So it'll be an interesting mix, and we'll see if this makes sense. So typically things like kind of acknowledgments, that sort of thing, it's kind of left to the end of the talk, it mentioned it all, but I really feel obligated after spending so much time here to say something up front. For those of you who don't know it, the UC Berkeley School of Information is really it's a wonderful place to get a degree, whether a master's degree or a Ph.D. It's an incredibly nurturing environment. It's an environment where you can really explore a lot of things, kind of veer off in your own direction, which can be good, it can be bad, it really depends on who you do. But so I wanted to take the chance to thank Anna, who's here, thank the faculty who are here, and the students, especially my committee, all of whom are here too. I really appreciate it. All of my friends and family. So for those of you who are here, you really helped make this school what it is, and my experience here what it is. So thanks a lot. And it's funny when you have to acknowledge people, actually give credit to people. There's this crazy thing where you have to say, I want to give you guys all the credit for all the good stuff that you're about to see, but then dissolve you of any responsibility for the stuff that sounds kind of off the wall or bizarre, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But in some of that attempt to kind of provide the right amount of credit and to distance everybody else from any responsibility or authority or authorship in this, you get some of the strange contortions that we have to go through today when we think about creativity and authorship. And that's some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. So, SOPA. I don't know how familiar everybody is with this particular acronym, but it stands for the Stop Online Piracy Act. Yeah, lights may help a little bit. Hopefully the camera will. Oh, sorry, there is a camera going in the back, and there's some audio being recorded in the front, just so you know. But this stands for the Stop Online Piracy Act. It went to the House of Representatives. Didn't actually get to the House of Representatives. It went to the committees. There was also its sister bill, HIPAA, in the Senate. And this bill was really the kind of latest in a whole bunch of in the kind of anti-piracy legislation. You guys may have heard of it because it created quite a stir towards the end of last year, end of last calendar year, and the beginning of this year. You saw things like, I think once this kind of hit the internet and was really going in full force, there was like a censor bar on the Google logo. I think Wikipedia took itself down for the day on January 18th. A whole bunch of sites went off the internet. And there was this huge fight about what these provisions actually were, whether we had the story right, whether it would be effective legislation, whether it would be enforceable legislation, whether it was a kind of policy that a freedom-loving nation like ours should really be involved in, what kind of freedoms it was kind of curbing or promoting internally, externally. I can't go into all the details. There are people in this room who are actually experts at this, and they're the ones you should talk to, and I'll point them out later if you're that concerned. But when the SOPA controversies emerged, I was really wrapping up my dissertation, and even into this year I was done, which was nice. And so I was looking at this research. I'm doing this work on young artists and their use of the web. And when I started kind of seeing what this debate was all about, two things kind of jumped out. I'm going to start with the first. And it was this idea that came out that SOPA breaks the internet. This was a common kind of rallying cry for people who were against these bills. And what was interesting to me about this was that there are people actually kind of on the street, different people kind of out there in the world saying things that academics have been saying for a long time, but I haven't really seen it as much out there, which was, it doesn't just break, if the internet were ever actually a series of tubes, let's just pretend it was a series of tubes, like what's his name from Alaska said. In this case, they're saying, well, it doesn't just break these series of tubes, or all the protocols, or all the stuff underneath that you can't see. It's actually breaking a fundamental belief system. And there's one fundamental belief system that sits behind the internet, and that's what SOPA is breaking. So SOPA breaks the internet technically and ideologically, and this kind of built in all kinds of assumptions about when I started to read about this, built into this were a lot of assumptions about how the internet actually works, both technically, but also how it works kind of ideologically or ethically and morally. And that related to some things I'm going to talk about in my dissertation. So I've been doing this research on this giant website called deviantART's.com. I'm assuming that nobody really knows much about it, maybe outside of my wife and my parents. And my advising committee, of course. They know more about it than they actually want to at this point. But so I want to relate the SOPA and PIPA controversies to something that happened 2 years ago, actually, the summer of 2009. I've been studying this website a social networking site for visual artists where people can post their work and get feedback, network socially, network professionally, and a range of other activities. And I'm going to say a bit more about it. I'm going to come back to in a second. But so if you go to the site now, you'll see like a page like this on the left where people put up their artwork. And somewhere on this page will be these tools, these kind of sharing tools. And those look pretty conventional, pretty standard. You'll see tools like this all over the web, the New York Times, Hulu, all these different sites that you might go to on a regular basis. And when these were launched in 2009, those were already pretty much standard on a lot of websites. So DeviantArt was doing nothing new here. And in fact, they felt behind at times. The people actually running the site and some of the participants in the site felt like they were really behind because they didn't have the kind of tools that everybody else already had. And for some people, putting these tools up actually fixed something that was long overdue and fixed something that had been broken on DeviantArt for a long time. But for a lot of other people, these tools actually broke DeviantArt and broke DeviantArt in a lot of different ways, which I'm going to describe more in a second. And what it did is it led to like a tumultuous 6 weeks for people on the site. It was a highly disruptive event that broke out, kind of called a share wars, what they started to call it amongst themselves, people who use the site. Really, and you started to see towards the end, or like at kind of not the end, but at the height of the arguments, you started to see quotes kind of like this one. You know, and this is kind of an elite speak, kind of playing off people's ignorance, saying, there's vast misunderstandings about the basics of how the interwebs work. Basically saying people just don't get it. These tools, nothing wrong with these tools, it's just how the internet works. So instead of thinking about what does it mean to break the internet, here what some of the issues are is what does it mean for the internet or the web to actually work in the first place. Now, in a really unexpected way for me in my dissertation research was this question of how the web works or how the internet works became one of the key questions that my dissertation ends with. It really couldn't have been a question I could have started with. My committee never would have let that get through. You can't start a research project like this question, how does the internet work? But that was the question that was really important to know at the end, and I didn't quite know why. And in part, one of the reasons that I realized was that it was a question that a lot of scholars, a lot of people who write in the business literature, kind of the popular press, they have clearly a lot to say about how the internet works, and they write a lot about it. But it's also a question that I realized that everyday people, as part of what they do on an everyday basis and part of their lives, they are implicitly asking this question and are explicitly asking this question. And in both implicitly asking it and explicitly answering it as part of what they do every day, my argument is that they're actually helping to produce the web in practice. It's not something that just exists separately from what they're actually doing to make it work. So when you ask questions, things like, what does it mean to break the internet? More importantly for me, what does it mean for the internet to work? It's a statement both about technical misunderstandings, ideological misunderstandings, moral misunderstandings, ethical misunderstandings, and all these things are actually operating at the same time, as I discovered in my research. And what I'm going to argue is that there are these different tensions, these layers of working, that are actually helping people to produce the web kind of as we know it, or as different people know it. So before I jump too much into this argument, I wanted to say a little bit more about myself. Like I said, I've been here for a little while. I'll say your age. You don't want to say what your exact age is, so I'll just have been here for a little while. Most of my work has been at the intersection of youth, creativity, and the web ever since I started. I did some early research projects around design research with kids. I contributed this huge kind of research project looking at kind of youth and new media, always focusing on questions about creativity, collaboration, appropriation, kind of copying and pasting code on the internet that teenagers are involved in. And this is the stuff that actually got me thinking a lot about the topics that I'm going to be discussing today. And for me, what was interesting is that a lot of my research, in a way, is a self-critique of some of the stuff that I was writing about 4 or 5 years ago, or kind of where my head was at. And so I can say more about that later, but I just wanted to throw that up there. This is really where I'm kind of coming from here. So let's see, for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be going through a few things. I'm going to describe some of the motivation for the research that I did, give you an overview of the project, an overview of DeviantArt, and some of the themes that I tackled. Then I'm really going to dive back into the share wars that I introduced already, and there's a serious question of art theft and what art theft was all about. I'm going to then bring that back up to more of my research that I did in general, and then really ask some broader, more speculative, maybe crazy questions that could be of interest to some of you, or may just, be just me going off in my own world. So I'll come back to that at the end. So motivating the research. At the beginning of this talk, I said there were two things about SOPA that were interesting. I've only mentioned one. And the second one had to do with this. So SOPA it described itself as a bill to promote prosperity, creativity, entrepreneurship, innovation, et cetera, combating theft of U.S. property. It described itself as a defense of creativity, and of course, those people who were opposed to SOPA described it as an assault on creativity, and they had a lot of good reasons for saying so. So you have this word creativity right in between, and they also rallied artists to kind of both sides of the cause. There were people who were signing petitions who were in favor of these bills, there were artists signing petitions who were against these bills. And in some ways, this really shouldn't be surprising. If you read this book, it's a nice long book on the history of piracy from about the past 400 years. It's a great book, though, highly readable. I highly recommend at least certain chapters if you want to get through parts of it. But what the historian Adrian Johns argues is that every time this word piracy comes up, there's something big at stake. And what's at stake is the nature of a relationship in society between creativity, communications, and commerce. So back to the SOPA debates, when I was reading through some of the stuff, I saw something kind of buried in a lot of the way people talk about it. And it was often pitched as an old versus new. The older industries, the older generations of people, the older ways of doing business just aren't going to cut it. New technologies and new practices. And there was a formula at work, both in the SOPA debates, but also one that really seemed to rehash a discussion that had been going on throughout kind of my time here, at least, or throughout most of the past decade, and probably going kind of longer back, which is that you have these new technologies, you have a new generation of people, and you're going to get these new conceptions of creativity and new kind of cultural practices, or new ways of thinking about property and the institutions that regulate creativity. So I'm going to tackle this formula for a second. So let's look at, so by new technologies, at least in the last half decade to a decade or so, what we're mainly talking about is all of this stuff. So there's this really fun word called Web 2.0, kind of made the rounds in the middle of the last decade. People still use it even though a lot of people don't want to use it anymore. But it's still a word that's in vogue a little bit, Web 2.0. And the most exciting thing for some about Web 2.0, no matter what it was user-generated content. Meaning the stuff that people put up on the web and kind of out of their own bedrooms or living rooms or kind of other space, and they put up on the web for people to share and work with. And there's of course lots of controversy about whether this whole term Web 2.0 is just a buzzword, is it marketing hype, what does it mean? But it certainly has captured the attention of a lot of people over the past decade. And as Michael Zimmer, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and did their kind of equivalent to information school there, he kind of summed things up nicely. So I'm just going to read and kind of quote a bit from what he said. For him, he said, when we talk about Web 2.0, it really represents a blurring of the boundaries between web users and producers, consumption, participation, and production, authority and amateurism, play and work. He goes on to say that kind of rhetoric presents certain cultural claims about media, about identity, about technology, suggesting that everyone can and should use these new technologies to organize information, to share information, to interact with communities, and to express oneself. It promises to empower creativity, to democratize media production, and to celebrate the individual, while also relishing the power of collaboration and social networks. So that's a mouthful, but that's sort of the kind of sum of what Web 2.0 may have been about for a lot of people. And in my look at the literature on this topic, I actually saw some similar themes here. So in my research, I described this as a kind of Web 2.0 creativity consensus, a way of thinking about the relationship between Web 2.0 and creativity that really captured these four main points. One is the web has democratized creativity, that creative production is really a social and collective endeavor, but importantly, it's anchored in community. It's non-commercial, it's non-market, it's part of a participatory culture, not a commercial culture, and it's revolutionary. And here are some of the key texts. Some of these authors don't necessarily agree with one another on all points, and sometimes they don't always agree with each other from text to text. But here are some of the texts that I think kind of capture a lot of these ideas. In the introduction to my dissertation, if you want to read through that, I kind of go point by point and show how in the last couple of years, scholars have started to kind of critique these points one by one in lots of interesting new ways. I'm not going to go through that whole critique now, and at the end of my dissertation, I kind of come more on the side of the critics, but I do so in a very different way, I think. So that debate's been going on for 10 years or so, maybe a little less. And especially kind of in the last few years, it really picked up when some of these ideas have been really started to be kind of taken on. At the same time, there's been another debate since the late 90s, a term you might be familiar with, the idea of digital natives or a digital generation. People familiar with this language? I think the term digital natives originally coined in 1999. The idea of a net generation or digital generation actually goes back a little further. So there's been a lot of rhetoric about this, and to me, it's kind of a blending of technological determinism meets kind of generational determinism. In this debate, these ideas were actually challenged pretty much as soon as they were espoused to begin with. And so there have been a lot of debates also in this area, proponents of this thesis, people who are against this thesis. It's clearly still very popular in the public imagination and the press that there is a digital generation, they're doing a lot of work. But actually, some of the people who have espoused it kind of initially have started to scale back some of the arguments. And what they've started to say is, there isn't necessarily one digital generation, but there are certain people of this generation who are unique. That still persists in the argument. And the people who are unique are the ones who are the real digital natives, the real digital generation, are those who are engaged in creative activities and in social networking. And I'm going to skip kind of some of the actual details of the quotes I'm talking about here. Y'all would trust me, and you can again read that introduction if you don't believe me. But so we're kind of rolling back some of the argument, but the formula's changed, and it's changed a little bit. So you have these new technologies, and instead of like a new generation of people, it's really a particularly media-producing, social networking, savvy subset of this new generation. Those are the ones who are kind of highly digital, highly engaged. Those are the digital generation. So any claims that we were making before, let's just scale them back, and we'll talk about it in terms of those people. So when it comes to talking about creativity and issues of property and stuff that I introduced earlier, you have quotes kind of like this. So creativity is the upside of this brave new world of digital media. That's really the high point. The downside is law breaking. The vast majority of these digital natives, again, let's talk about it in terms of just that subset of the most creative. Those are the ones who are currently breaking copyright law on a regular basis. It's pervasive practice in an entire generation. Well, here I'll scale it. Actually, kind of when they wrote this, they were still thinking about everybody in this vast population, but these are some of the folks who have done a really nice job of scaling back their arguments in very nuanced ways. And so they've actually been some of the people who I would read the most about this. Lawrence Lessig, the law professor who's written a lot about this over the last 10 years or so, he gave this, at TED, he gave a talk, and he talks about these tools of creativity are the tools of speech for our kids. It's how our kids are speaking, it's how they're thinking, it's how they understand themselves. I'm kind of summarizing here a bit. It's technology that's made them different, and you can't really kill the instinct that this technology produces. You can only make an outlawed, and by making an outlawed is very destructive. So he's very concerned. He's most concerned about our kids in this sense. So in the Web 2.0 debates and the digital generation debates, there's some stuff that's missing, and it's actually missing to kind of different extents in each debate. On the one side, a lot of what's missing, and this is especially true because some people have kind of pointed out with the Web 2.0 stuff, is the specifics of platforms and technologies are actually really important to consider. And a lot of the critics of the Web 2.0 creativity language have gone to this side. And they said, listen, you guys, we need to be talking about the specific algorithms that actually rank content and help curate content. We need to talk about the specific platforms. Are they for-profit? Are they non-profit? Are they small? Are they large? Are they global? Are they local? So all these things. And they're really here looking at, launching a critique from a technology point of view. Now, also missing some of the debates, especially with the Web 2.0 debates, but less so with the digital generation debates, is missing the specifics of people and what they actually do with these technologies once they've incorporated them into what they do on an everyday basis. So most of the criticism of the language of digital generations and digital natives started from here and just said it's not tenable if you actually look at what people do. But kind of what I saw in a lot of that work is not really paying attention to how these technologies have been designed, how they seem to work internally, how different aspects of them are built and constructed. And clearly kind of relating these two things has been something that only a few authors that I know have tried to do well. It's usually you have to go one or the other and then take other literature and put them together. So one of my key objectives in my dissertation was actually trying to find a way to relate these two things. And clearly it's going to be missing some out on the technology side and missing something out on the practice side. We're trying to bring these two together. What helped was a bunch of theory, and for this audience, I'm not going to go through all the theory, but for those of you who are interested, here are some of the authors that I'm citing. I'm going to say a little bit about each one, just to the extent. I come from like a social practice perspective, and in my work I combine a sociological understanding of social worlds, the whole body of literature. The most important thing for me here is really this discussion that That it's not that there's some idea of social structure in the abstract kind of impacting individual agency and individual choice, nor do individual decisions kind of determine what that social structure looks like. Those two relate to each other, and those two are over time transforming together. And I'll skip over the rest for now. Infrastructure is a term I use a lot, and by infrastructure here, I'm not talking about wires and train tracks and things that people often think of when thinking about infrastructure. It's related to concept in information studies. It's a very kind of relational concept, meaning that certain things, certain practices, certain technologies, certain ways of thinking about the world, those become over time infrastructural. And they only become infrastructure to a set of really institutionally organized sets of practices. So what might be infrastructural for some people really are not infrastructure for other people. And I'll say that and let it go. And then the last thing, also kind of coming out of social practice and social worlds theory, is a particular way of thinking about authorship and artistic recognition and creativity. One is thinking about these things as kind of collective products, collective processes that are historically linked, particularly important, historically linked with distribution systems. And also important in this argument is this notion of the kind of romantic notion of a creator, the individual genius where creativity comes from. It's a powerful idea in our society. And clearly what people who are arguing on behalf of Web 2.0 folks are saying that is a myth. And in fact, that's a myth that's long been recognized in sociology, which is true. The important thing that a sociological perspective on these issues gives us is to think about, well, let's not just dismiss something as a myth, but why is this myth so important? Why is it important that the idea of the individual has sustained itself? What is the impact of that idea on the practice itself? And not just dismiss ideas of individuality and throw them out the door. And so given all this theory, and given what I said earlier, I started my project with two large, kind of complicated questions that impact each other. One is thinking about the importance of these people who are trying to become creators, trying to become recognized by others as creators or artists. How does engaging on the web help them develop that sense of identity and that sense of practice and creativity? And then on the other side, how does that process of people trying to become recognized as creative, trying to become having an identity as an artist, how is that impacting how the web changes over time? So those are my two big questions. That's where I started with. And now I will jump into a kind of overview of the project. Pause for water. So, earlier I brought up deviantART. Now I want to say a bit more about it. So like I said already, it's a full-featured in the sense of all the bells and whistles of what we think about as Web 2.0, what's written about Web 2.0, you can find on this site. So not only do people post work, they also have blogs or journals, there's different forums, there's chat rooms, there's ways of ranking things, curating content, tagging content. I mean, you name it and it's more or less there. I'm including some of the sharing tools now that I threw up at the beginning. It's got this tagline that it's had for a very long time, where art meets application. And part of what I'm going to describe today is really that it's not a very easy or seamless meeting between art and an application or a web application. So it's a for-profit company. It's been around since the end of 2000. For those of you who remember, that was right when the bubble burst, more or less, and it survived that and thrived in the past 10 years. I put these numbers up to suggest that, give you a sense of the scale. We're not talking about Facebook, but we're also not talking about a small web forum. We're not talking about a site where you go and there's like 30 or 40 kids hanging out online. It's hard to get exact demographics. I used some sites to think about that, including Quantcast. Got a sense from those numbers and also what people said, what they felt experientially, that the site tends to skew young, people who are teenagers in their 20s, but I also talked to people who kind of, the oldest person I interviewed I think was almost 50. So it's really kind of is a range of people. And it covers lots of visual art, almost every form of visual art over time. These categories just multiplied over the past 11 years. The only thing it doesn't really have is music, but it even has like literature. It's got people take pictures of their sculptures and throw it on there, and it's got a whole range of stuff. So in studying this site and this topic, what did I do? Let me just give you a one-shot at methods. People are laughing because they've seen this before. Some people have seen this before. But I spent a lot of time hanging out on deviantART, doing what's known as kind of online participant observation. What that entailed, I can only give you the highlights now. I joined the site, I joined as an art researcher, I told people what I was up to, and then I proceeded to use the site Not exactly how everybody used the site, because clearly I was an art researcher and they were artists, but I tried to kind of engage with them in what they were doing on an everyday basis. And I used the technology, the platform itself to help me do that. And I used that to really get at some of the key issues that I was going to be studying. What was it that people were having to deal with and grapple with on an everyday basis, and where could I take that? From there, I proceeded to go into kind of other field sites. So I went offline in the sense of going offline to see what are some of these issues? How did some of the same issues I was seeing on DeviantArt, how would those look from other perspectives? And so I went to a series of art and anime conventions where lots of the same people who run DeviantArt were there doing a lot of the same things, but doing it very differently, clearly in a physical space that was institutionally structured very differently than DeviantArt. And I did interviews. And I can clarify those methods later too. So I want to give you a sense of the broad findings and themes. PowerPoint slides, this is not like PowerPoint. PowerPoint slideshows are famous for Venn diagrams. The Venn diagrams are almost always misleading. This Venn diagram is also misleading. But I have it up there anyways, because I want to illustrate the point of convergence, that what I learned quickly in the first few months of being on DeviantArt, it's a much more heterogeneous, complex site than I would have guessed when I started. And it's definitely much more so than its stereotype is out there by people who are familiar with the site. So you have all these different art worlds, these different ways of thinking about this kind of umbrella term art, which can mean a lot of things, all merging on this site, all kind of coming together. And with that comes different motivations for even using this site in the first place. People of different ages and levels of experience are on the site. So you have this site that, even though it's ostensibly all about something called art, which, as you know, we kind of know is actually not any one thing, they're all kind of coming together, all on a common set of platforms and technologies, but can give you a sense that there might be something different here, which is something they might differ a lot. And it turns out there was a lot of anxiety, debate, and disagreement as to what should count as being recognized as an artist. What does an artist have to do to be, what are the right dispositions for an artist? And at the same time, how DeviantArt as a site was going to be shaped and constructed as a platform for kind of recognizing, conferring this identity, this recognition as an artist. And throughout the course of the research, there was continual balancing acts between different ideas about art and how they should be kind of managed and sustained. And the balancing acts weren't necessarily intentional. A lot of it was unintentional, but it's kind of what emerged out of it. So some of the big topics I covered, again, these are the kinds of things that you'll actually see on a lot of different websites, especially kind of Web 2.0 websites. So people worrying about how to get discovered, how to get recognized, different forms of feedback and engagement with other people, sharing and ownership of content, and then how they kind of relate it to certain particular features of this site, features which you see on other sites. So algorithms for ranking art, favoriting systems, the kind of display of quantitative data and metrics, how people comment, different ways of commenting, and so on and so forth. And here, for the rest of my talk, I'm really going to talk about these last two areas. This issue of sharing and ownership, which I introduced at the beginning, and the tools for doing so. So back to the share wars. For those of you who weren't here earlier, there was kind of like a depiction. There's these tools. You go to the site now. You have these tools. And these tools I can describe as highly conventional, even when they were launched in 2009, because over the course of the previous 10 years, there have been kind of two things going on. One is these different technologies that people argue were for sharing, different sharing technologies. I put sharing in quotes for a reason. But things like embed tags. So if you go to YouTube, where that screenshot's taken from, there's this little bit of HTML and CSS code. You can copy that very easily. It's exposed at the interface so that anybody can go and copy that. You can paste it in some other site, and what appears on another site will kind of be different. There's this term APIs, which stands for Application Programming Interfaces, which is what makes all these little buttons here from the New York Times actually work. And there's been an explosion of every site having APIs and libraries for developers and others to hook into, ways of sharing content, and finally, kind of URL shortening services. And so these are the things that kind of appeared eventually on DeviantArt's launch sharing tools. Now, alongside of these different technologies for sharing, there's also been a rhetoric of sharing. And this idea that the internet really is for sharing. So the language of file sharing has been around for a long time. There's been a discussion of the sharing economy, or some other person's language, an economy of shareable goods. And when you read the literature and the way people describe sharing, there's lots of different things that sharing might mean. In some cases, sharing actually refers very broadly to any non-monetary exchange. So anything that's not a commercial transaction is a sharing transaction. For other people, sharing sometimes refers to like a contribution to a common cause, kind of like we're all sharing something together. And that relates to collaboration, except that some people argue that it's not just about collaboration, it kind of builds on collaboration, there's more going on. People even talk about unknowingly sharing, that somehow you can share something but not even know it and it's still sharing. The one thing that, of course, that does not slip in any of this is the overwhelming positive connotations. I mean, sharing is always a good thing, you can't have bad sharing. And that's kind of a trend with the Web 2.0 world. These have these big words that are always good things. Words like community, creativity, sharing, social, collaboration, all good things. So before DeviantArt launched its share tools, it actually had tools that let people move content around. And there are two important things about it I want to point out. One is that from a design perspective, they're kind of highly disconnected. First of all, they didn't appear on the same part of the page. And they felt really distinct and different from one another. And also kind of discursively, in terms of language, they were different from one another. So you had the language of sharing something, or blogging it, or promoting it. And promoting and sharing, I think, are two very different verbs. The thing like the embed tag was in a totally different part of the site, not even related to promotion or sharing at all, it was just there. That's one important thing. The other important thing is that these tools are optional. So if I was submitting something to the site, I could turn these on and off in different ways and let people have them on. So that was the default originally, they were optional. When these tools were launched in 2009, two huge changes. One is like from a design perspective, I've actually been a designer, this was a much better design. It was clean, all kind of grouped together kind of holistically. Also, in a sense of what the purpose was. This isn't just about sharing. And you had all these tools linked together on sharing. It was up to date, using the latest technology. Also, they were no longer optional. So just kind of on everybody's page, these tools are now up here. As it turns out, like I said before, a lot of people like this. They felt like it's about time we had this. Every other site has this. This is not a big deal. And of course, a lot of people, as I pointed out earlier, are really pissed off about this. What I want to say up front, this thing about being optional or not was actually important. But it wasn't the only thing that was important. So kind of keep that in mind as I walk through the story. So the early reactions to these tools focused on a common theme with the web. What people argue about a lot when we talk about the web, the question of control. Who has control over what? Especially when it comes to personal information. We're talking about who has control. So now there are a few different kinds of control. So the person on the left, I don't expect you to read through this whole quote, but basically this person on the left is saying, you know, the way I practice my art, because of my career, my individual career, which was being a teacher, and my choice of artistic outlet, I want to be able to separate those two things. I've been highly successful at separating those two things through the course of my time on the site, and I want to continue to do so. Now, having these tools optional isn't going to dissuade somebody from linking to my work, but at least I'm not here saying, please, everybody, see what I'm doing here. You know, so they're trying to disconnect. So that's one aspect of control. The other quote is really about a different kind of control. What this person was arguing about were two things. One, instantly concerned about his artwork on DeviantArt, posted the way he wanted, having all these commercial logos all around him. That was a big problem for him. It was like, oh, look where my work is, right next to the Twitter button, and the Facebook button, and the MySpace button at the time, although there's probably no MySpace button anymore. But there are a bunch of other buttons that were sitting around the work, so that was one thing that pissed him off. But at the same time, the other thing was that having his work, his thumbnails, just showing up on some other people's site, framed much differently than he chose to frame his work, really was a problem. And this is a very old issue when it comes to art. How is artwork framed? Is art determined by the kind of content itself, by the frame around the art, by its placement in a museum or gallery? So this is a familiar story that we're seeing here. But I want to just point out these are different kinds of thinking about control, not the same things. Now after a day, though, this started here, it started peacefully, it was very kind of organized, it was like, okay, it's about control. Quickly the story exploded. It exploded because people took this in a new direction. This is not about control. I mean, it is about control, but the issue really is something called theft. And so you had quotes like this. These tools are enabling theft, and I think DeviantArt's a bunch of hypocrites who are on the site, who complain about theft all the time, you never make it easier. And that's where people started to really get pissed off. By people, I mean both the staff of DeviantArt, like in this quote, the CEO is saying, this is offensive, it's not acceptable, it contradicts our core mission. We don't want it. But also a lot of people on the site, perhaps even the majority of people on the site. It's actually no way I can tell if it was the majority or not. But people hated this idea, this is about theft. I mean, after all, these are sharing tools, how can it be about theft? So before I continue with where this argument goes, I think it's really key now to say something about theft and what art theft really was to the people on the site. I've been on the site, I remember up to this point, for almost 2 years when this kind of unfolded. And I had seen lots of headlines kind of like this. People worried about art theft, seeing their work appearing on other people's sites, seeing their work appearing like cup holders, mouse pads being sold on eBay, reproduced, even being sold in stores in the mall. All these different things. So there was a lot of discussion about theft. Theft came up in interviews, even when I wasn't even asking about it. People would talk about it. When I was at these art conventions and these fan conventions, people would just say things, would ask me, "Oh, what do you think about theft?" So it was an issue that everybody talked about. And it came up in some like interviews like this. So this is an interview with Sharon. It was over Instant Messenger. She was a really kind of web savvy teenager who was really into her art and photography. And she had a very vehement objection. She talked about, she actually stopped posting her work on DeviantArt. It was one of those things. She found DeviantArt to be a hotbed of theft. She didn't like seeing her work spread around the internet. She told me about some horror stories that she had seen from people, some of them that I went back and was able to confirm and see in other places, including the press. And this is really a problem for her. But it still raises the question, I think, okay, so what is theft anyway? What makes some particular action theft and something not theft? And perhaps, unsurprisingly, on a site that is as kind of heterogeneous and different as I tried to introduce earlier, what theft was not any one thing. So for some people, it was all about permission. If you didn't ask for permission, you're potentially kind of guilty of stealing. But for others, it wasn't just about permission. There were some things you didn't have to ask for permission for. Maybe you had to give credit for. And for others, well, maybe you didn't need permission or credit, but as long as you didn't use it in some way that had some kind of material gain or a symbolic gain. And by that, I mean like certain kinds of status on the site. The question of material or symbolic gain can lead you off on a big detour as to what the differences were and how the web actually kind of complicates those things, I think, in some interesting ways. But I'll skip that for now, but if you want to ask about that, feel free. But despite all the differences, there was a couple points of implicit agreement. One is that there was this sense, even by some of those who were the most permissive, they kind of felt compelled to have to compromise in a certain way. And I saw this. People were saying, okay, I might not think you need permission for everything, but yeah, other people may feel differently, and in that case, you really should respect the work of all artists. And now we actually kind of scaling back their own, kind of is reeling back in their own kind of highly permissive sense of theft. But the most important thing that there was almost a universal consensus, though not explicit, was this idea that whatever theft was, it was a moral threat. It was a moral threat in the sense of a long history of thinking about kind of rights and artwork as like moral rights and individual moral rights and property. So theft was seen as a moral threat to one's identity. The very nature of being an artist or being a creator or being recognized as such really came, like this issue was huge in impacting how you felt what theft was all about. So somebody said, you the kind of stuff that you might see elsewhere, or somebody said, it's really a cheat. If somebody else uses your work in different ways, you put all this hard work into it, and they go ahead and steal it. And so it makes you feel like your efforts are useless, that you have had no impact, that your whole identity of being part of this is kind of, obviously kind of riffing on her quotes, not everything she said, but all for nothing. And then kind of extending on that, somebody else in another interview said something kind of similar, but said, it's not just about the kind of cheating aspect, but theft really demoralizes artists. It keeps people from actually putting any effort in the future. It's not something you especially are excited about anymore, not something you really want to put on the web anymore. And without that effort, what's the point? So it's a moral issue. And people spend a lot of time trying to find different ways how to combat theft. They posted warnings. They try to use some of the Creative Commons licenses in different ways that the site provided. There were watermarks. They spread the word to these networks, like you saw before with the headlines. There were these vigilante groups in the site that try to patrol the borders here. And what I just want to say about this here is that what was interesting about this is actually a lot of these practices were also contested. So if you engage in some of these practices, you're also potentially guilty of doing something that an artist shouldn't do. For all of these, even posting warnings was seen as not necessarily good practice. And watermarks are the same, it's another interesting one. So given that these were subject to criticism and practices were subject to criticism, when something like art theft comes up in that debate over the share tools, it's like, one, that it comes up at all as an issue, and then what is it that we're actually talking about? And so it kind of spiraled out of control for those 6 weeks. And you saw things like responses to this. First of all, people saying, was sharing, did that equal theft? Or are you saying it leads to theft? I mean, what are you really saying? And so we have quotes like, you can't discourage people from posting a link, therefore you can't discourage sharing, therefore you shouldn't post your work in the first place. People started making fun of people, saying things like, I don't even use a browser, obviously, which is a joke because they're all using deviantArt. But they're saying, I don't use a browser, I don't even use the internet to protect my rights, you got to get rid of URLs, the addresses from the internet. So they're kind of really ripping these people apart. And this quote that I had at the beginning, well, it's just a misunderstanding about the basics. People just don't get it. They don't get how the internet works. And what I discovered over analyzing this debate for the course of 6 weeks, looking at some of the history of it and as it was going on, it was really about 4 different things working. And then those 4 things working in a couple of different ways. So much more complex. So I'm going to walk through these. First, there was a question as to how do these tools, quote unquote, work? Is it just linking, as some people would like to say? Maybe it's not. They work differently. You have these little Twitter buttons, you have Facebook buttons, you have these embed tags, you have these URL shorteners. Like, what are these things actually do? They're actually doing different things. And other people said, yeah, and it works differently if you do it with Facebook, if you do it with Twitter, and you do it with other sites. So these things don't even all work the same. Some people pointed out, we don't even know who owns our content when it's magically transported to Facebook somehow. We don't get how that works. So that was one debate. That kind of rolled up in this broader question, how does the internet really work? So people would say, well, don't post the internet at all, because that's not how the internet works, and other people got really mad at that. Basically saying, listen, I know what you can do on Facebook, and it's not what you can do on DeviantArt. In fact, if I go to Facebook right now, I can't even find, this is almost a direct quote, I can't grab some picture of a frat boy and share that all over the internet. They have different privacy settings, so I can't control that. So why is it Facebook can do something and DeviantArt can't do something else? So is there really one internet? No, I don't think so. And if there was even an internet, can content be controlled, and is the internet really all about sharing? Now these tools, talking about the tools and talking about the web, really got into these much deeper questions that I've been hinting at all along. And one was about this notion, what's a community? And how does a community work? And this is an old discussion, clearly an old discussion in society, but an old discussion even with respect to the web. It goes back well before the times of the well and the old kind of bulletin board forums. What is a community about? How does a community operate online? And so there were some people who felt, in the big picture, I should say, there were a lot of people who didn't think DeviantArt was a community at all. And they said that, even though DeviantArt described itself as the world's largest online art community. But the staff and a lot of members actually put a lot of work into making DeviantArt a community. And so for this, there were people here who felt DeviantArt was a community. And even amongst that group, there was a split. For some people, DeviantArt was an open community for anybody to join and post their work. And therefore, if you disable the sharing tools, you're really going against our ideals about sharing and openness. Whereas others said, yeah, I get all that, but the site described itself as a site where it's for artists and for art lovers, which is what it says on the site. And if that's the case, shouldn't there be some kind of borders around it? Like, aren't there borders around DeviantArt that have existed for the past 9 years or 10 years that are different from other sites? And if so, don't we need to have some kind of closing around those borders? So community took on a very different meaning. And finally, art. And I've touched on some of the issues when it comes to depth, but how does art work? What are artists supposed to do? What are the rights of an artist? How important is this context in which art appears? And finally, something I haven't said much about, but it came out in the debate, is what kind of marketing is acceptable? What kind of visibility of artwork is really kind of what you want? These kind of tools that some people presume that everybody wanted their work to be seen as much as possible, and a lot of people didn't actually feel that way. So we have the situation then where to some people, it's just kind of the nature of the web, how the web works, and everything is great. And for others, what happened, we came up with these share wars, was a serious breach of how they understood DeviantArt, how they understood art, how they understood the internet, and how those things all interact with one another. There was a resolution on the site, and one that might not be too surprising given the way these things are typically resolved on the net. Went back to options. You have some options, which is what a lot of people wanted. It was a nice compromise. You could show these tools, you could hide these tools. For the first time in DeviantArt's art history, you could actually say, only show this work to somebody who's logged into the site. So that was new. So here's a nice clear case of when something changed, and changed somewhat radically based on the protests of lots of users and this kind of fight. But what I think is also important is that the current tools are really kind of a hidden compromise. And they're a hidden compromise in the sense that for some, this kind of reinforces the idea, especially if you go to the site now, just reinforces the idea that this is the way the web works. DeviantArt's a place to share, DeviantArt's on the web, the internet's a place to share art. And for other people, it kind of held on to the idea that DeviantArt is a separate space, a distinct space, it's unique from the rest of the web, sharing here works differently than sharing in other places. DeviantArt, like the web itself, is a place where you can actually try to exercise some forms of control over how your work is spread. and where ideas about moral rights in artwork are supported. So the question is, clearly the question is, what is all the work being required to do to make the internet this medium for sharing that we all kind of hear so much about now? And sharing continues to be kind of just how the web works. Think about all the work being required to do so technically and ideologically, and not just by those who are kind of in elite status, but these sort of everyday users, everyday artists who aren't necessarily part of the mainstream discussions about the web. So I want to just say a few more things. One about how this relates to the rest of the projects. I know you guys are all eager to go off and read 300 pages of this. It'll get your afternoon going really. So part of the thing I'm talking about here, one of the bigger themes is you're having these kind of historical tensions in art, kind of colliding with these historical tensions that are related to the web. I've touched on a little bit down into the community and corporation. There's some others to do with centralization and decentralization. And when people talk, and this is helping to propel the way DeviantART's being used in design and practice, and that I think even more kind of broadly is extending to the web in general. It's hard to kind of flatten out a whole series of arguments and some circles and arrows, but that's my closest attempt for now. So it kind of fuels really the ongoing production of what it means to be an artist, and it fuels the ongoing production of what the web is supposed to be about. And I tackle those with two other topics besides sharing and theft. One I've already talked about a little bit, having to do with visibility. So I have a chapter on looking at kind of recognition. What does it mean for an artist to be an artist, and how it interacts with certain features of the web. How does visibility matter? How does popularity matter? How does quality of work matter? And I talk about those in light of features of DeviantArt that you'll see in a lot of other places. So the display of metrics, like how many page views your art or your pages accumulated, how high you're ranked on these scales, almost like a Google search. These awards called daily deviations, and how these are all related to each other. And this brings us to the kind of discussions that have been prevalent for the past 10 years or so about the kind of wisdom of the crowds, and Google's PageRank algorithm, and Dig, these different features for kind of voting things thumbs up and thumbs down. And I relate them back to a kind of long-standing issue that's kind of, there's a nice book about the history of fame, written that kind of spans the last, well over 1,000 years, and he talks about the kind of, well over 2,000 years, and talks about for the past few hundred years there's been this gradual democratization of fame, but it comes with a paradox. And what the argument is that, and this is started again several hundred years ago, more and more freedom and opportunity for some kind of fame and recognition, but also more and more anxiety and uncertainty of what actually determines artistic recognition or fame in any sense. And my argument in the dissertation is that the web actually exacerbates this paradox. So we have this increase in participation, this increase in people being able to get their work out there, with this tremendous increase also in other people being able to filter it, curate it, organize it in different ways. And these are both kind of democratizing, and maybe it's questionable whether either are, but let's assume that both are democratizing forces. They may actually go right up against each other and not actually be kind of leading to one kind of outcome. So I have a chapter about how DeviantArt kind of grapple with some of this stuff. I also talk a lot about learning. I have a chapter on learning, different sets of tensions about what kind of feedback is the right kind of feedback for an artist to have, how it relates to feedback being given in art school, and some of the artist alleys and conventions that I studied, and what are the right ways to learn. And I talk about those in light of kind of rhetoric around Learning 2.0, which I did a lot of work with when I was at some of the older projects that I kind of touched on briefly, about the kinds of resources and whether or not the actual web kind of creates a new form of learning that we haven't seen before, or takes a really old form of learning and does it better. And I actually think that DeviantART's participants, better than I can, actually challenge a lot of this rhetoric directly. So, to conclude, thanks for hanging in there. To conclude, I'm going to say a little bit about thinking about creativity in an information society, kind of broadening the lens even further. And this might be interesting for those of you here at the information school, but I want to start with this quote that's from the anthropologist Elizabeth Hallam and Tim Ingold. They describe, if you're right, creativity is on everyone's lips these days. In a global commodity market with an insatiable appetite for new things, where every aspect of life and art is convertible into an object of fascination, a desire to be appropriated and consumed, creativity has come to be seen as the major driver of economic prosperity and social well-being. So with regards to the last part, this is kind of language that's been around for a while, that creativity is the driver of change. There's a race for creativity in a networked world, as one NSF, National Science Foundation report put it. And so DeviantArt to me actually was right in the middle, right? Not necessarily just in the actual center, but issues on DeviantArt and the way DeviantArt was being used by a lot of its users was really kind of percolating into this world. And there are three things that I want to point out. about, I'm not even sure I actually agree with this quote, that every aspect of life and art is really convertible in the way they like it to. But I understand what they're saying, and there are three things that I think they're saying that are related to whether or not they are, and it's an open question. One is the material. One is the digital technology as really the material basis for kind of new economic orders. And clearly we're seeing new business models driving social media companies that are all about commodifying things that you could never commodify in the past. So Facebook and Twitter are really commodifying everyday conversation in some really new ways. I mean, if I post this slide presentation to SlideShare and it's being videotaped, I am commodifying my slides maybe in new ways. Even things like just moving around. So there's a whole kind of there's a critique against those who think that everything is like kind of in response to these invisible forces of capitalism. That's saying, look, people move around, they do things in space in ways that certain kinds of companies they can't get at, and it's very great, it's good. But if you think about what like location-based services are doing, and Foursquare and Apple and stuff, I mean, we're finding new ways to commodify things that you couldn't commodify, just moving around in space. And of course, people are giving up access to that, so it's not a one-directional thing. The second thing I want to say is a lot depends here on new distribution infrastructures and the social process of distribution of content and of people's identities. So when we talk about Web 2.0, there's a lot of discussion now is blurring between production and consumption. And you have words that are actually all about production, like one is prosumption from 1980s. There's producage. There's a few others. They have some really nice ideas kind of wrapped up in them. But what seems to be always missing is distribution. And this word is important to me because if you go back historically, as I hinted at the beginning, the way distribution networks work has had a huge influence on how things work, where the locus of power really is. And I feel like distribution is kind of like the Kaiser Sose of this thing. I'm used to Usual Suspects, but he talks about the greatest trick Dr. Devereaux pulled to convince the world it didn't exist. And here, distribution is the devil. It's saying, production and consumption, great, go for it. I'm just going to go and do my own thing. And there's a lot of power in distribution, and it's not really talked about as much. So we have this nebulous industry, this nebulous class of professionals and labor, all part of distribution. So I'm curious about the kind of broader ecology of these new media distribution infrastructures, and the institutions, the platforms, and the people. And finally, this lovely word information, which is on our school of information. So my kind of, where I end some of my thinking about information is that sitting alongside distribution infrastructures or networking technologies and digital media, the term information is part of the conceptual infrastructure that really kind of enables some of the convertibility of things like every aspect of life and art and everything else. And so Jeff Numberg writes about the fact that information is a term and a concept that allows people to kind of take things out from their everyday practice and situation to how they're produced and consumed or distributed and move it into some other way. So what are some of the consequences of framing or reducing things like creative practice, artistic practices, media practices, and the products to information? And I think what I've shown is some of that. Where sharing art becomes the same thing as sharing information, then suddenly new possibilities and new problems present themselves. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. There's tons more food out there. We have at least this room booked for a half an hour to ask questions and discuss this stuff. And feel free to leave, and I will have hard feelings. But thanks so much.
Disruptions whenever you have a disequilibrium event in some community. I mean, so we probably could have something similar going on now with Facebook's acquisition of Instagram.
Yeah.
Because that's very similar. But there could be other kinds of disruptions which are less similar, but you can still see a kind of disruption in community practice.
Yeah.
So do you think of it like some kind of continuity, a continuum of disruption based on the kind of disequilibrium event?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. If I understand it right, you're asking something to the extent of, we see these kinds of disequilibrium, these kind of events where things get disrupted. So Facebook buying Instagram is one example, or even just kind of changing the way the newsfeed works, right. Timelines. Right. So this is something that we see every day, that on a kind of regular basis. a website, if you're using a website and something changes and a lot of people get pissed off. And I think part of that is clearly going on here. There is this sense of how we're used to doing things is changing. So there is kind of there is a continuity in that respect. What I think there are two things about that that are important. One is that I think that in the course of a lot of these things, I think it always reminds people on a general level how vulnerable we really are. So we do all this stuff and we think things are the way they are. We have everything in our lives working quite the way we think they are, and something comes in and changes it. And what changes it is essentially like something like Facebook, and people now built up a set of suspicions around Facebook, whether or not to justify it is not the point of this talk at all. So I think that's, but I also think that what I'm interested in recognizing are where are there arguments where people are upset, not just because of a change, not just because their life isn't what it used to be, but a change kind of like this one, and there's some other ones talking about my research, where it's not just about things are different than they used to be, but there's a lot of competing issues that go way beneath the surface that have to do with really kind of nature of who it is, who they are, what it is they believe, how they practice who they are through their identity and things like that. And I think there are definitely many other circumstances like that on other parts of the web for sure. In this case, it has to do with art. And I wouldn't necessarily expect to see issues of art always being the same issues in other places. But I think it's important to try to recognize, when does this change really matter? Why would it matter? So with these sharing tools, it was really getting at people's fundamentals, some of the fundamentals of what they felt that art was really all about. And if their identity was wrapped up in art, then it's not just attack them. It's not just, oh, things don't work the way they used to be. It's like, man, my whole notion of what it is I'm doing here has been tweaked. By some group that I thought that maybe I trusted or even I didn't trust. I don't really know what they are. So does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Was it Galen?
One of the things I think is kind of really exciting about this is that it's just on a really broad rhetorical level. It changes the David and Goliath phenomenon from children versus the content industry to now the users are the creators that are going up against the big internet, sort of the big internet phenomenon. And I just think that's really interesting because creators as sort of like the scrappy, user kind of thing, gets lost in the debate over copyright more largely than the internet. So I think that's really cool that you sort of flipped that.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I'm glad you got that out. That was one of the lessons, kind of one of the points I try to make, that I think the story of the kind of Goliath Disney smashing the little girl on the internet is a nice story, and it works effectively for certain kinds of policy conversations, but I don't think it necessarily kind of reflects the reality of the situation. And knowing when you're using something rhetorically for policy is different than necessarily trying to reflect a certain reality. So I appreciate you pointing that out. Andrew,
I just was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on what you saw in terms of construals of community among nominal community, sort of how they perceive that as existing or not existing, and so like how they sort of define who was part of the community.
that is a great question. Community, I guess it seemed to operate on a few different levels. One was kind of rhetorical. I mean, like a lot of other sites, deviantART said, we're an online community, and that's a term that's been around. That's a term, not as a concept, but a term like from the kind of early 90s. And so deviantART clearly, like other sites, they were a community. It was clear that the site, the way the staff organized themselves and what they actually did on the site by being active members of the site and trying to promote certain kinds of events and certain kind of norms and dispositions, a lot of the site really believed there is a deviantART community, or if there's not one, over time there's multiple communities. There's these communities organized around different art types. So there's a photography community and a stock photography community and a fan art community. And the people, like, especially by kind of enrolling, you actually enroll different people from the site to help actually run parts of the site. That all added to the sense that we're all in this together and there are some shared norms. Now, I think some people, including the staff, realized that some of like I said, the deciders told me that maybe that's not really one community. Maybe deviantART's like a society and there's lots of communities. But they also try to do things like, so they claim, try to limit growth. to actually not try to have it grow totally like this, where it's a hockey stick, where we're going to go from like 10 million people to 20 million people to 100 million people. They claim that they want to try to keep the numbers. Once they saw the numbers spiking, they actually want to try to, in a sense, close down some of those boundaries, because that could be highly disruptive. There's some quotes about that. So those are some of the ways they try to make things a community. Often the community language came up, though, when other people were critical of it. They were critical of it when they said, DeviantArt is all about, DeviantArt's not a community, it's all about X. And that not is really important, right? So it's not about community, it's all about individual popularity. It's not about community, it's all about corporation. It's all about business. It's all about kind of companies. And so trying to relate community to corporation, which again is something that I think if you go back into the history of the well, which is this whole thing from the early 90s of Howard Rheingold, he actually not only kind of coined the term virtual, this idea of what a virtual community is, he was one of the kind of early warnings of saying, we need to worry about what the web, or what wasn't the web at the time, what the internet technologies might become when we have lots of commercial practices and corporations dealing with community and how these two things are going to be kind of held up together in tension. And you just saw that kind of articulated all over the place, even people who weren't kind of members anymore. You did see it on different forums. DeviantArt's not a community, it's something else. And that, I think, is actually a really important way, in a sense, to say something about what a community is and what exists. Does that get at there?
It does, yeah. The oppositional thing is interesting about community as contrast to what we think is really happening also.
Yeah, and that was some of the ways that I actually got at, so this distinction between commercial practice and community practice, why are they making that distinction? They don't have to be distinct from each other. I mean, as we know, in fact, as DeviantArt was trying to say that every day, us being for-profit does not take away from this being a community, but people not everybody kind of agree with that. So making an opposition is actually interesting. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, you may have alluded to this already, and I'm not even sure if I have a question or really is this a comment.
You can phrase it.
No, it's the discussion of this theft, and on this kind of discussion that came from the DeviantArt community.
Yeah.
Makes me wonder if an attempt to find an absolute value of what theft means, but it occurs to me it's almost like a Heisenberg uncertainty principle. As soon as you try to investigate something and see what it is, when you measure the weight of the position of an atom, that measurement changes it. Maybe it seems like some of those comments were that the idea of theft changes as you try to decide what is theft, what is it that is being stolen, and how is it being done, and what are the interactions between the people that are doing it or commercializing whatever. In actual fact, the notion of theft changes, and maybe the notion of a lot of things change as you actually study them. Maybe the notion of community, maybe the notion of confidentiality, as the internet, these questions come up, will actually change what it's all about.
Yeah.
It's almost like instead of being a bunch of tubes, it's like a giant microscope, and as you're trying to look at it, it changes position. It's not what it was before.
That's great. I mean, so you sound like a budding practice theorist, although you don't know. Jean's back in the room. She can evaluate that. But yeah, that sounds. I agree. I mean, I generally actually agree. I've actually used that in my own writing. It is like a Heisenberg uncertainty principle. In fact, this one slide. This is my Heisenberg uncertainty slide in my own way of thinking about it. That where does this thing? Where is recognition? It's kind of which point is it at? And every time you try to figure out where it is, it does move. And I completely agree. I don't think there's a question answer, but it's very hard to. It makes kind of studying in the real world very difficult. And so you sometimes occasionally have to hold things kind of constant, but knowing that they are being artificially held constant. With in contrast, an approach which sort of says things are either continuous over time or continuous over space at all times. And so you try to do your best to actually study those things and come up with a general way of describing the world that is kind of theoretically informed. But Paul.
Dan, it was very nice talk, and I was really interested to hear this version of the distribution as a critical theme.
Yeah.
As a kind of aside, I confess that I've got no work done for the past 2 years because the Levin's inquiry is on.
Yeah.
And what I think was actually brilliant about Murdoch was not actually his journalism, but that he understood distribution.
Yeah.
And he broke the old unions because he bought a distribution company, Skype. So, but what interested me in this context is that if it's the thing we've been missing, there's one of the people you talk about, I mean, the great mantra of Lessig is that the web was end to end, or the net was end to end, and all these nasty things that we try to come into the middle and corrupt that ideal state. I was just wondering whether that is again another of these extreme oppositions. I mean, in fact, was the web ever like that? And in fact, is it more that we have to take account of different kinds of distribution rather than say there should be no distribution, that should be ideally end-to-end, which is the less ideal?
Yeah, wow.
Sorry.
No, that's a great question. Because I think in some ways what you're pointing out is this things, I mean, there are actually people here who kind of study this, the actual idea of what end-to-end networks look like and how they work and how, and so on and so forth. What I think one of the things this research has kind of taught me is that the notion of end-to-end, at least the way I understand it, is somewhat artificial. Not because things are continually clogging up the middle, but because at the interface level, there are continually things being built up. And so the end is always a moving target. So there was a time when you had, every time they add a new feature, a new set of tools, it kind of changes that experience of using whatever that end is. So for people who don't know what, I don't know if end discussion too much, sorry. But the idea that all is a network and then kind of points and people can just reach each other. I think there are always people trying to design how that experience is at the end that gets changed. So first of all, it's not a static thing that just started end to end and then basically added more and more stuff in the middle. I think actually more and more stuff has been added at the ends and in the middle. So it changes kind of the temporal structure of it in the way it's structured. To your other part of the question, I think you're right in that I think it's always been a myth to some extent, kind of end to end. There is no, in a way you can say, there is no unmediated kind of reality. There's never a reality that is entirely one person to one person with nothing else helping, at least, to structure and constrain and control that conversation. Whether it is the whole kind of context that comes with presenting a lecture to an audience at an information school or at an academic campus and not being at an art museum right now and not being one-on-one. So there's all these things that always affects any kind of communication. And so end-to-end in that sense is kind of a myth. So the question is, what is built up in either in the middle or around the outsides? I don't quite know what the metaphor, what the right kind of visual is here. But there are always these kind of distribution infrastructures that are being built up over time. They're not always like if you kind of try to pin things down, they're not always distinct from the production infrastructure or the consumption infrastructure, as production and consumption are not entirely distinct from one another. But being able to kind of evaluate it as like a separate thing could be really helpful. And so I think in the late 90s there was this great term, disintermediated. That was the business model of the internet. People who studied this or read about it a lot, like in what was Industry Standard, it's a magazine from a long time ago. They love that word disintermediated. And so that's clearly, it became apparent that the web wasn't disintermediating anything. We're having lots and lots of new intermediaries. There are businesses being made, and there are really productive businesses, and helps people live their lives in good new ways. So let's not pretend that things are being disintermediated. Let's recognize these intermediaries for what they are and what they're doing, and all the good they do, maybe some of the bad they do. If it really is about good and bad, which probably isn't. Does that actually answer the question, or am I just riffing off it? Great, okay.
I'd like to ask a question, which is, did the period of discussing what to do with theft increase engagement among users of the site, and did that engagement in turn produce more artistic production, or did it stifle artistic production? In other words, isn't this overall a good thing?
It's a great question, and it's a great question. And it's a question I actually can't answer. Like I don't have the data to say whether or not it increased or decreased. It'd be an interesting study to try to figure out how to measure that in a way that could actually really answer the question. But there's also a tension there because there's a notion that's on the web now that the key thing is just engagement. If you get people to engage, one, they're doing more productive things for themselves, they're happier about it, they're actually making the tools useful for themselves, and at the same time, in a kind of nice kind of win-win, businesses are profiting from engagement, and everybody wins. It's certainly possible that, and I think from deviantART's perspective, so the CEO, the term he used to use was called friction. And he actually liked friction sometimes. He said he tried to design friction into the site in different ways. because he wanted people to be talking about this stuff. He didn't want this to be a place where nobody actually argued about it anymore. And he felt that it was productive in a lot of the ways you're talking about it. And so the question is, when are these tensions destructive and when are they productive? And with theft, as some of the quotes said, for some people, they were destructive in the sense that produced a lot of anxiety and a lot of frustration and potentially demoralizing, potentially dissuading them from doing art. There's no way to know. I mean, there are people who, kind of one of the key kind of concerns in I think some of the economic discussion of copyright now is, does the law of copyright, which I haven't even touched on here, does that really dissuade or increase creative production or not? People have different opinions about that and try to measure it in different ways. I'm not sure there's a good answer to that question, but for me, some of the point here is that it certainly affected how they experienced the arts. And not always in ways that I think you could say, oh, it's like drinking medicine. It tasted bad for a while, but wasn't really good in the long run. Or you could say, drinking medicine, it just tasted bad and you have bad memories. And that, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I wouldn't necessarily say it was a win-win. I wouldn't say, you could certainly kind of hypothesize this is a win-win and try to figure out if it really was or not. But the theory I would bring to that kind of study would be like, a lot of opportunities for some wins and a lot of opportunities for some losses, and let's try to figure out how to measure which. Is that like I said?
Yeah.
Cool. Ashwin.
Yeah, thanks for a wonderful talk. It's nice to see your work laid out in some behind bits. But I wanted to come back to this question of distribution because I think it's really interesting. When you put production, consumption, and distribution together, it kind of makes you think of, factories producing goods that go on trucks that are then distributed to places where they go into shops where they are then consumed. But what you're talking about is something quite different, right? The notion of distribution, at least the way that you talked about it, sounds more like, well, there are people who are individual producers, and there are people who are acting as distributors of fuel, who choose to take something and share it somewhere else. And there are individuals who are then consuming it. And that the platforms that we talk about are just enabling this distribution, but that it's substantially quite different from the other form of distribution. So could you comment on that term itself and how it might actually be different? Because the reason I ask is that even as we talk about corporations versus community, and intellectual property versus a commons of art and so on, there is this question of more political economy, if you will, of where does the corporation begin and what does the corporation look like and what does the creative industry look like if the mechanism of distribution is actually substantially different to the point where the word itself doesn't mean the same.
Yeah. That is a really good question. And I think you're right in your analysis of thinking about how the very notion of distribution has probably changed in a lot of ways. And probably much in the same ways that what it means to produce or consume, especially in terms of media. So we can kind of expand this out that we're not, when we talk about producing and consuming media, we should be kind of careful with that language as well, never mind distribution, because consuming media means something very different than consuming food or I don't know, consuming something else, or flying on a plane and consuming an airline ticket. So all those words I think have been changing. All those words, the words have been changing, what they mean have been changing, what we try to refer to when we're studying those conceptual topics has changed. So you're absolutely right, they have all changed. And I do think that the web has added a new layer of how stuff gets, the other words could be exchange or circulation or things like that. And certainly one of the things the web has done is it's helped make visible or enroll new people into the distribution system in a way that I won't necessarily say that's unprecedented, but if you think about what is able to be, I guess, used by the actual kind of the actual companies, right? So let me just step back for a second. If you imagine that as part of consuming media and distributing media, the key part has been how people sit around and talk about those television shows. How people talk about TV has been studied now for a long time, saying this is a really important aspect of the consumption of television shows, or consumption of television shows is. People talk about television shows. They've been doing so long before the web. and how they help spread the word about what a television show is all about is part of, potentially you could say, it's part of the distribution, broadly speaking, of what that show is and how it reaches new audiences and so on and so forth. Now, that's been kind of hard to pin down. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily say, well, that conversation is part of the distribution. I might say it's part of the distribution infrastructure, but not necessarily part of the distribution system, the distribution chain, or whatever the right business term is here. But now with the web, I think you can make that claim in a way you couldn't before, in that sense. You can say, oh, well, if we monetize how people converse about our show on Twitter, and we actually leverage Twitter explicitly, or Facebook explicitly, to enroll people as part of our distributing this content, then we do kind of have a new game in town. Maybe there's a different word than distribution, but it kind of replaces or kind of takes the place of a new version of it. And you look back to the 18th century and think about the new ways that things like copyright law has changed the nature of the distribution system of books, or how there's plenty of things you can stick in there across history. So make sure I'm answering your question and not like missing the key point. But I think your observation is right. I mean, this stuff does kind of move a lot. Great. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a follow-up question. So what do you think is actually being distributed then in deviantART? Because it's not the art itself, because you can see that somewhere else. I'm wondering if perhaps it's attention or reputation that's being distributed.
I think there's at least two things. One, I think the art is being distributed, because for some people there's very few other ways that they've decided to use or found useful, or they kind of know about the ways of getting their work to be seen by other people. But clearly there are identities as artists, whatever that means. As I say, it's part of what's being distributed here. Much like a brand name attached to something. I mean, every time kind of Coke sells its Coke, it's not just the Coke that's being distributed, it's Coca-Cola, and maybe some other stuff too. So I think you're right. There's a lot being distributed, and attention certainly is. And then the things that measure attention are, the things that matter to advertisers are, so metrics, page views, how many times is this impression being sold, so impressions are being distributed.
So one of the things that was a recurring interest to me as we talked about all of this was that most of the people on deviantART are so young, and most of the people we talked about. And so often they were addressing issues that were new to them, but not new to the world at large.
Exactly.
And talking about things like, this is how copyright works,
Right.
as if they knew how copyright works.
Right.
Do you have any sense of how things might differ if you were dealing with more adult artists? And we did at some point, not in this presentation, but talk about those who went to art school versus those who didn't. So a lot of deviantART members are just very non-institutionalized in their approach to art. So do you have any sense of how this might differ if it were more of a kind of mainstream art community, or at least older?
I think it's hard to say. Only, and the reason I say that is because a lot of the people, like some of the people who I interviewed, I should kind of quote it here, were older or felt they had some formal training in art to some extent. And there was nothing in the act. There was nothing that I saw that suggested that this is kind of a generational thing. People feel one way or another. Except that I did feel there was a little more idealism and kind of naivete of younger members. But it didn't mean that as they grew older, as they grew, had a little more sense of how things that they necessarily changed their kind of opinions about this. But there were certain people. So, for example, there was a guy I interviewed and talked to a lot. He said, I used to really get mad. I used to get mad when I heard that a design that I made reappeared in a T-shirt in the Philippines and was being sold. Right? This happened. He said, now, I don't mind as much. I don't mind because I'm hoping that people will see that shirt and maybe wonder who made the image, even if I didn't get any credit and know it's me, and that could be good for my career. And I don't mind because maybe that's just the way the world works, and I can't do anything about it. So certainly I think as people got older, maybe there's some kind of complacency could set in. But I don't think there was anything fundamental about, because the site was so large, and people who I studied just kind of ranged across the board, that I don't know. I mean, I think that these opinions and ideas are kind of conditioned by who people hang out with, interact with in groups. And so you can certainly find a group of lots of art collectives who want to throw out the whole machine properly. And if they had younger members join them, or like if you some of the stuff here, people who are 18 who are like, screw copyright and get rid of all this stuff, because that's their side of the idealism school question, which is like, copyright's wrong. It's almost like believing that Columbus discovered the world when you're 11 years old. At some point you learn that Columbus didn't discover America, and then it's like, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you say that Columbus is a big fraud, or do you say, oh, what did Columbus really do? And people just react so differently. And so there are people, I'm sure, in their 30s and 40s who will argue that Columbus discovered America, and other people would say Columbus is a big fraud. And I don't know if it's generational or not, but that's the best answer I think. Yeah, there's an aspect to it that you want to further on. I think it's a great question. I mean, it was something I was wondering about and we talked about for a while. So I was like,
Well, and you
can
started
I
this
use
presentation by setting up the opposition of
Yeah.
people who talked about additional natives.
Yeah, I think that thesis certainly I have a problem with, and I have a much more, a lot of concerns about that thesis for a lot of reasons. There's too much diversity. Ray. Wow, I should just open up. Awesome.
One of the things I kept thinking about, because of this sort of culture of remixing and so on the internet, that there seem to be, at least on the surface, you have the sort of categories that people would put their works into. And among those was the sort of fan art thing, where the whole idea is to take somebody else's ideas and reproduce them.
Yep.
I wondered if you looked at sort of how people in those different categories may have viewed share or steal.
That's a great question. And the short answer is yeah, I did spend some time with that. And the two groups that I ended up spending the most time with, you could define them as groups. One were fan artists. So I went to a lot of these conventions and hang out with a lot of fan art. There's also a lot of fan art on the site. So fan art, again, is the idea that you really like Mickey Mouse, and a lot of your art is based off of Mickey Mouse. So you draw Mickey Mouse in different ways. You draw comic books about Mickey Mouse. It's stuff that, if you're into art, you kind of do as a kid. It's your first entrance into a lot of the practice. You know, the people I talk to, it's their first entrance. You know, they got the Snoopy lunchbox, started drawing Snoopy. It's a story. So that's fan art. Is one thing I looked at a lot. And the commercial side of fan art, because the conventions I went to, I saw a lot of that. The second group I studied, or I wouldn't say I studied always kind of as a group, but I kind of hung out with more on the website, were people who practice stock photography. Kind of a different thing. Stock photography is the kind of practice of making a piece of artwork or kind of taking a photograph almost explicitly for the purpose of being reused in something else, which radically changes the kind of theft conversation then. Because then it becomes not about can you reuse this, or very clearly what are the terms of reuse. And fan art in a way is similar because they're already saying we're going to reuse something. So there were differences. And the differences I think had to do with those kinds of practices and what different worlds of fan artists and different worlds of stock photographers were like. So for example, stock photographers on DeviantArt try to develop a very explicit set of policies and rules of what people could do with their work. And a certain pattern that was kind of taught to new stock photographers on the site as to how do you get your rules followed, how do you place them on the site, how do you write them, how do you create them. And so for them, it was really about, it wasn't about permission. Them posting in a stock photography was a permissive act, and they all recognized that. For them, it was like, what kind of credit do you want? And they all wanted credit. In fact, one person said, you know, we don't ask for blood, we don't ask for money, we don't ask for chocolate, we ask for credit. And this was somebody who was older, actually one of the kind of leaders in their late 20s. And she said, that's really all we ask for. And so it's how is that credit given? And is the credit given on the terms that we ask for? Because that matters to us. And it's really not about the money at all. I mean, it's not like, are you making money off my work? I don't care. You're totally disrespecting me as an artist. Fan art was really interesting for some of the reasons you said at the beginning. Because fan art was people who felt that they had some implicit right to use some piece of work and to do something with it. And sometimes that meant selling it or selling a version of it. But it really then all had to do with how much am I allowed to sell? Is there a limited distribution that I can sell? Do I feel that the person who I'm still going to endow with this genius as the creator, whether it's the kind of creator of some of the cartoons from Japan or whatever it was, they might still very much believe in this kind of ideology of the creator, but feel like the creator has kind of given people that right. They know that they want these things. And they know because, one, stories are exchanged. Oh yeah, so-and-so is fine. They want people to actually reuse their work. It's part of the business of anime to have other people drawing their work. Or they make up other reasons. And some of them are, but I did hear a couple times people saying, hey, if I know it's not right, if I know that there's a guy who used to write, I think it's Calvin and Hobbes, who would police Calvin. I might have this wrong, which was an actual fact. That was his impression. Calvin and Hobbes was kind of highly policed. You put up fan art of Calvin and Hobbes, it might be taken down faster than other stuff. And his sense was, the creator kind of has that right. I mean, that's really the right of this person. Even though all these people in here are selling this work and doing stuff with it, if they're told not to because the creator says no, that's a real issue. Because people really worship these creators. And people had a lot of anxiety about their own practice. So you had people who were saying, I don't really want to sell fan art. I'd rather sell my kind of original art, but I know I can't sell original art because nobody's going to buy it. They want to buy fan art. So if I sell some of the fan art, I'm getting interested in my original art. I don't feel very good about that, but I'm going to do that. That's really different than stock market. Because it did very different kinds of conversations. So the fact they're all using this common set of platforms and tools, I mean, it's like, okay, so these are all art. And this has to get to the point that, I mean, the whole word art is this really this weird word that's encapsulated a lot of stuff in the past. Only the past 200 some years is a word to talk about lots of different kinds of practice. More than 200 years, but not too much more. So that raises some other questions about that. And that's a good stopping point. I heard the bell. I don't know what that means.